payback time. The GOP nominee Trump said choked like a dog. He could be headed to the U.S. Senate. The 11th hour begins now. Good evening once again from our NBC News headquarters here in New York. I'm Nicole Wallace in for Brian Williams. Day 348 of the Trump administration, and tonight there's breaking news in the Russia investigation. The founders of Fusion GPS, the firm behind that explosive Trump-Russia dossier, are speaking out tonight about what they learned about Donald Trump's ties to Russians. Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch writing an op-ed in the New York Times that details their investigation and the process by which the results of that investigation were shared with American government officials. All of this is information they have testified to before 3 congressional committees. Simpson and Fritsch confirm in their piece that they hired former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele and write, quote, "Yes, we hired Mr. Steele, a highly respected Russia expert, but we did so without informing him whom we were working for and gave him no specific marching orders beyond this basic question. Why did Mr. Trump repeatedly seek to do deals in a notoriously corrupt police state that most serious investors shun? What came back shocked us. Mr. Steele's sources in Russia, who were not paid, reported on an extensive and now confirmed effort by the Kremlin to help elect Mr. Trump president. Mr. Steele saw this as a crime in progress and decided he needed to report it to the FBI. Also from their piece tonight on what set off the original U.S. government investigation. Quote, "We don't believe the Steele dossier was the trigger for the FBI's investigation into Russian meddling, as we told the Senate Judiciary Committee in August. Our sources said the dossier was taken so seriously because it corroborated reports the Bureau had received from other sources, including one inside the Trump camp. The intelligence committees have known for months that credible allegations of collusion between the Trump camp and Russia were pouring in from independent sources during the campaign. Yet lawmakers in the thrall of the president continue to wage a cynical campaign to portray us as the unwitting victims of Kremlin disinformation." Let's bring in our leadoff panel on a Tuesday night. Chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, Peter Baker. White House bureau chief for the Washington Post, seeing me for the second time today. Sorry about that, Phil Rucker. White House correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, Eli Stokols. And Jeremy Bash, also doing double duty. He's former chief of staff to both the director of the CIA and the Secretary of Defense. And Jeremy, I'm going to start with you because I feel like you and I have had conversations about the dossier, about what it is and isn't, for many months now. And now we know that what it isn't was the match that ignited an investigation by the U.S. government into potential ties between Donald Trump's orbit and Russians.
Yeah, I think importantly, Nicole, from the individuals who sponsored the dossier's research tonight, we learned that the dossier merely corroborated information that the FBI already had, meaning the counterintelligence investigation to the Trump Organization and its work with Russian individuals, Russian oligarchs, and potential Russian intelligence officers. That counterintelligence investigation was well underway when Chris Steele, a respected former British intelligence officer, came to them and said, hey, there's more to this story between the Trump Organization and Russia. And I think importantly also, Nicole, as these individuals who sponsored the research called for their testimony to be released tonight to the American public, a call that I think should be heeded and should be agreed to by the Congress. It's all about the money, the financial transactions between the Trump Organization and Russia that really requires much more scrutiny.
Peter Baker, you've spent time in Moscow. I want to reread you part of what I already read about from their piece. But they write that what came back from Mr. Steele's research shocked us. Mr. Steele's sources in Russia who were not paid reported on an extensive and now confirmed effort by the Kremlin to help elect Mr. Trump president. Mr. Steele saw this as a crime in progress and decided he needed to report it to the FBI. Can you, Peter Baker, speak to how you might guess, from covering this president, from covering this White House, how you might guess the president is going to turn this into some sort of deep state conspiracy when it's perfectly clear from this piece that when Christopher Steele, a former British intelligence officer, thought there was something that required government intervention, government action, he did exactly what you're supposed to do?
Yeah, what you'll hear from President Trump's defenders, at the very least, if not from the president himself, is that this dossier was used somehow to get a warrant to investigate and spy on even the Trump campaign last year. That was something you heard at some of these congressional hearings a few weeks back, as the Republicans are trying to turn the tables on this investigation to find another target for this sort of heat-seeking missile that's out there. And that target was meant to be Fusion GPS, the firm that these two people have founded and they're writing about tonight. I was also struck by the suggestion in the piece that we should be looking at Deutsche Bank, the German bank's funding of President Trump's finances over the years. They said that they told the congressional committees that that would be a fruitful area of investigation, but as far as they know, that nobody in the Congress has actually looked at the bank records for Deutsche Bank. The only bank records they say the congressional committees have looked at are their own.
Let me follow up on one thing you said, and then let me promise our viewers that I'm going to read that section you just mentioned about Deutsche Bank from the piece after that. But let me follow up on your assertion, your prediction, which I'm sure is correct, that what Donald Trump's defenders in Congress are likely to do with tonight's revelations is to try to turn it into some sort of smoking gun, if you will. That theory, though, that the dossier is what instigated the original investigation was blown up by your paper's investigative unit. The reporters, Mark Mazzetti was on our show earlier tonight. Matt Apuzzo's bylines on that story, and another one of your colleagues. We now know that the original investigation into potential ties between Donald Trump's campaign and Russia was from low-level George Papadopoulos, right, Peter Baker?
That's exactly right. And the other writer, by the way, on that piece was Sharon Lafreniere, who was in Moscow with me back in the early era of the Putin tenure. So she's spent a lot of time covering Russia as well. And the story found that the investigation got underway because George Papadopoulos, then this campaign advisor to President Trump, was bragging at a drinking session with an Australian diplomat about the fact that he knew that Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton. And once those emails were leaked last year, that Australian diplomat, obviously his government, then contacted the American authorities and let them know about this. That's what seemed to have triggered the initial interest on the part of the FBI long before this dossier was assembled or part of the equation.
Eli Stokols, let me bring you in on the second point that Peter raises, and that's another piece from the op-ed tonight, written by the founders of Fusion GPS, the firm that commissioned the Trump-Russia dossier. They write in tonight's New York Times, quote, "We suggested investigators look into the bank records of Deutsche Bank and others that were funding Mr. Trump's businesses. Congress appears uninterested in that tip. Reportedly, ours are the only bank records the House Intelligence Committee has subpoenaed. We told Congress that from Manhattan to Sunny Isles Beach, Florida, and from Toronto to Panama, we found widespread evidence that Mr. Trump and his organization had worked with a wide array of dubious Russians in arrangements that often raise questions about money laundering. Likewise, those deals don't seem to interest Congress." I spoke with a Democrat on one of those three committees before which Glenn Simpson and his partner have testified, who confirms that part of this piece. And I want to know from you if you think this is where Bob Mueller's inquiry may sort of revive the conversation from this White House that Trump started an interview actually with Peter Baker and a couple of his colleagues about how his personal finances, how his business records may be a red line for this president when it comes to the Mueller probe.
Yeah, that passage that you just read, Nicole, I think is the most damning portion of that op-ed as far as concern for Congress and the Republicans in Congress who have led these investigations. The authors of the piece are basically saying that there's a dereliction of duty by the people overseeing the investigation, at least in the House, with Republicans in charge there, and basically showing no interest in following this investigation where it would probably likely lead if they were more interested in following all of the information to a logical conclusion. It's been shocking to see Republicans in Congress, in the House and Senate, start to trash Bob Mueller himself, basically helping Trump and his legal team and his political team really soften up the ground so that if and when something comes down from the special counsel, that they can discredit Mueller, that they've already done some of that spade work. And so a lot of people out there don't believe whatever is found. I think the dossier is the key to this PR argument, this public relations pitch that Trump's defenders are making, which is that this is obviously just a witch hunt. This was something Hillary Clinton's campaign paid for. They were out to dig up dirt. Dismiss all of it. And I think that's why you have the two people from Fusion GPS putting this out there, because it's all being politicized and weaponized now, and when they get attacked, they're attacking back here. And so really what we're going to be left with at the end of the day is sort of people, and they're retreating to their corners in hermetically sealed political worlds in this country, and trying to figure out where that leaves us in terms of finality. Yes, the special counsel's investigation is going to probably, and already has gone further than the investigation led by Republicans in the House. But what Trump's defenders and what the people who are trashing all of this are doing is trying to get as many people as possible to just discredit all of it, including especially the special counsel and his investigation, because they know that's the most serious threat.
Jeremy Bash, I want to do just what Eli described, and I want to play you something that Jim Jordan, one of the president's defenders, one of the people who've been furthering what we now know to be a lie, this story about the dossier being the match that ignited the original investigation into Trump-Russia connections. I want to play you some of his questioning of Attorney General Jeff Sessions from a hearing in November. Let's watch and talk about it on the other side.
We know one fact. We know the Clinton campaign, the Democrat National Committee paid for, through the law firm, paid for the dossier. We know that happened. And it sure looks like the FBI was paying the author of that document. And it sure looks like a major political party was working with the federal government to then turn an opposition research document, the equivalent of some National Enquirer story, into an intelligence document, take that to the FISA court so that they could then get a warrant to spy on Americans associated with President Trump's campaign.
Jeremy Bash, I'm not going to say what I'm thinking, but, you know, there are rooms that are padded. There are places where people can hire staffers that can tell them not to say things like that in public. But there's also a greenlit campaign to spread lies about this investigation. And I wonder if you have a theory as to why.
Well, clearly, I think the Republicans want to defend the president, and they're worried because Bob Mueller, now as of December 3rd, has the cooperation of a very senior official, Mike Flynn, the former national security advisor, who's now turned state's evidence and is providing testimony and evidence against the president and his inner circle. They also know that the special counsel, in just 7 months, has won the indictments of the former campaign chairman and his deputy, and that they're going to be tried on multi-count indictments of corruption, money laundering, and tax evasion, and that they will be incentivized to also speak the truth about what they saw inside the Trump campaign. And so I think Republicans on the Hill are worried because as they have to step out there further and further to defend the president, they know that the facts make it very difficult to continue to do so.
Phil Rucker, let me ask you about the facts, because as the picture is getting filled in from your paper's excellent reporting, from Eli's paper, from Peter's paper, the stories being assembled by Trump's allies, they're falling apart week by week. And I want to read you something about their tactics, because Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch, I believe they're both former investigative journalists. Let me read you something else from the piece tonight. They write, in the years since the publication of the so-called Steele dossier, the collection of intelligence reports we commissioned about Donald Trump's ties to Russia, the president has repeatedly attacked us on Twitter. His allies in Congress have dug through our bank records and sought to tarnish our firm to punish us for highlighting his links to Russia. Conservatives news outlets and even our former employer, the Wall Street Journal, have spun a succession of mendacious conspiracy theories about our motives and backers. We are happy to correct the record. In fact, we already have. I assume the fact that they've already corrected the record means that they have already testified under oath to the 3 committees, but also to Bob Mueller's investigators. Do you think anyone in the White House is sweating this out?
Certainly the folks in the White House are trying to figure this out. I think this is one of the reasons why the 2 gentlemen from Fusion GPS want to have their 21-odd hours of testimony before the Congress released to the public, because it will be a sort of fully litigated offering menu of the facts, really, that I think would refute some of the theories that President Trump and his allies are pushing out there. And what you see the Republicans on the Hill, Trump's allies, and the president himself himself through Twitter trying to do is just completely discredit this dossier and use that to discredit the investigation itself and the question of Russia and make it all seem like a witch hunt, which is the phrase that the president has continually been using by pointing to the fact that some of this research was funded by the Clinton campaign. Some of it was funded initially by the Free Beacon, which is a conservative organization during the Republican primaries.
Peter Baker, let me give you the last word in this block, and let me just ask you to go back to your colleague Michael Schmidt's sit-down interview, the 30 minutes that he spent with Donald Trump at his golf club, an interview arranged in part with the assistance of Chris Ruddy. And I just keep thinking about what Donald Trump kept repeating, almost the way someone repeats something they're willing to be, that they want to be true, but they themselves are not sure. He repeated the term "there was no collusion," I think close to a dozen times in the interview with your colleague. Does that interview and that transcript from Michael Schmidt's interview with Donald Trump, is there any new, you know, like a kaleidoscope that constantly changes the dynamics in this Russia investigation and what we know coming further and further out of the water, like an iceberg emerging? Is there anything from this piece tonight that recasts any of what Donald Trump said to your colleague Michael Schmidt about collusion, about Russia, and about the investigation?
Well, it's interesting how intense he was right in that interview. As you said, they repeat again and again and again, there was no collusion, there was no collusion. To repeat it as if he was trying to convince, well, not just the outside world, but even maybe himself. And then you see today, you see this sort of series of very provocative tweets on all sorts of different subjects today, including Hillary Clinton aide saying she should go to jail. And it makes you wonder what is going on with the investigation that has him spun up, right? Is he agitated because of something he knows might be coming down the pike on this investigation, whether it be involving these Glenn Simpson and Peter Fritsch or not? And I don't know the answer to that, but he's very sensitive to this idea that there was collusion. He's very insistent on the idea that there wasn't, even though, of course, what we already know suggests that the Russians did offer help to the Trump campaign, and the Trump campaign, in the form of the president's own son, eagerly said he would be happy to take that kind of help. So, you know, it depends on your definition of collusion. Collusion is not a legal term, but we already see from the available evidence, the acknowledged facts in this situation, that there was, you know, there were ties between Russia and the Trump campaign.
Never a good sign when Peter Baker starts a sentence with "depends what's your definition of fill in the blank." All right, as a punishment for being brilliant and wonderful, all of our guests are sticking around. Still ahead tonight, Donald Trump's attack on the deep state Department of Justice. And later, mine's bigger, said no president ever, until tonight. The 11th hour just getting started on a Tuesday night.
Patients that I see that